Systems of stratification. Social inequality denotes a condition in which members of a society have different amounts of wealth, prestige, or power. Stratification is a structured ranking of entire groups of people that perpetuates unequal income rewards and power in a society. Income refers to salaries and wages, earned interest, stock dividends, and rental income. Wealth is an inclusive term encompassing all of a person's material assets. Ascribed status is a social position assigned to a person by society without regard for that person's unique talents or characteristics. Achieved status is a social position attained by a person largely through his or her own efforts. These background terms are necessary for our discussion of stratification. What does this map tell you about the patterns of wealth and poverty in the United States? Where do you fall with regard to median household income compared to the others in the state of Alabama or whatever state you live in? Four general systems of stratification as ideal types will be discussed in the next few slides: slavery, caste, estates, and social statuses. Some of them are more reliant on ascribed statuses, others on achieved statuses, and some are a mixture. Slavery is a system of enforced servitude in which enslaved individuals are owned by other people. There are many forms of slavery, including servile marriage, chattel slavery, and indentured servitude. Slaves in ancient Greece were captives of war or piracy, but their status was not necessarily permanent or passed on to the next generation. In the U.S., slavery historically was an ascribed status, and racial and legal barriers prevented slaves from being freed. More people are enslaved today in the world than at any point in human history. This includes people who have been made part of the trafficking problem. Sex slaves are slaves just as real as any other type. The degree to which nations consider sex trafficking a problem can be indicated by their level of compliance with the attempts to track trafficking. This list tells you something about that. A caste system is a hereditary system of rank, usually religiously dictated. For example, there are 4 major castes or varnas in India. Urbanization and technological advancement have brought more change to India's caste system in the past decade or two than the government was able to effect since formally outlawing the practice in 1950. The term caste can also be applied in recent historical contexts outside India, such as to the system of stratification that characterized the southern United States after the Civil War. Apartheid is another example. In both cases, race was a defining factor. A strong caste system exists in Nepal as well. The estate system, also known as feudalism, is associated with feudal societies in the Middle Ages, around the 1500s or so, where peasants worked land leased to them by nobles in exchange for military protection or other services. The peasants were considered property of the lords that owned the property, the land upon which they worked and lived. A class system is a social ranking based primarily on economic position in which achieved status can affect or influence social mobility. One can move from one stratum to another. Daniel Rosside's 5-class model of the class system in the United States differentiates among upper class, upper middle class, lower middle class, working class, and lower class. Upper and lower classes. The upper class is about 1 or 2% of the population of the U.S. Lower is about 20 to 25%, disproportionately consisting of Blacks, Hispanics, single mothers with dependent children of all races, and people who cannot find regular work or must do with low-paying work, often because of low levels of education. Also, sometimes because of where they live in the United States. Both reflect the importance of ascribed and achieved statuses. According to Galbraith, the rich are the most noticed and least studied among the classes. In the middle class, we recognize upper middle class, 10 to 15% of the population, and the lower middle class, about 30 to 35% of the population. Not all members of the middle class hold degrees, but they share the goal of sending their children to college. The working class is about 40 to 45% of the population, people who hold regular manual or blue-collar jobs. This is most notably declining in size, which is not necessarily a good thing. Many people in the working class make a great deal more money than those in the middle class. The Occupy Wall Street movement of some years ago sparked greater talk of class conflict. Conflicts over tax rates of the wealthy in the United States have grown sharper, and the gulf between the rich and everyone else has grown even wider over the last 50 years. Politicians often make a lot of promises with regard to closing that gap. Sociological perspectives on stratification vary quite a bit. Karl Marx viewed class differentiation as the crucial determinant of social, economic, and political inequality. Max Weber was critical of Marx's emphasis on economic factors and argued that stratification has many dimensions. In Marx's view, differential access to scarce resources shapes the relationships between groups and is the most important thing to consider. Controlling the primary mode of economic production is key. Capitalism is an economic system in which the means of production are largely privately held. Profit is the major incentive for economic activity. The bourgeoisie, also called the capitalist class, owns factories and machinery and controls most production. You may have heard the term bougie, that's where it comes from. The proletariat or working class are exploited by capitalist bourgeoisie. Marx predicted the exploited proletariat would eventually revolt and destroy all capitalist systems. First, they must develop class consciousness, a subjective awareness of their plight and of the need for collective action to effect change. Often, this means overcoming what he referred to as false consciousness, which is an attitude held by some members of a class that doesn't accurately reflect their objective position. Marx failed to anticipate the emergence of labor unions and did not foresee individual workers striving for improvement within free societies offering substantial mobility. His predictions have not, so far, come true. Max Weber had a somewhat different view of stratification. He was a critic of Marx's class model. He identified three distinct components of stratification: class, status, and power. Weber argued that the actions of individuals and groups cannot be understood solely in economic terms the way that Marx thought that they could. The level of wealth or income is not the only dimension along which persons may be stratified. Weber used the term class to refer to a group of people who achieved similar levels of wealth and income, but he used the term status group for people who have the same prestige or lifestyle. Status is not the same thing as economic standing. For example, a successful thief might achieve the same income level as a college professor, but the college professor has a higher status. Power is the ability to exercise one's will over others. Individuals gain power through membership in a desirable group. Weber examines stratification primarily from a macro-sociological perspective. Interactionists are interested in micro-sociology as well. Interactionists want to understand how social class influences a person's actual lifestyle or their lived experience. Veblen's concept of conspicuous consumption and conspicuous leisure can still be applied to the behavior of wealthy people today. Our lifestyles look different based on our social stratification. Is stratification universal? Stratification is universal in that all societies maintain some form of inequality among members. How it looks varies from one culture to another. From the functionalist perspective, a different system of rewards and punishments is needed for society to operate efficiently. Society must distribute its members among a variety of social positions. Positions are filled with those who have the appropriate talents and abilities, with the most important positions filled by the most capable persons. Rewards, including money and prestige, are based on the importance of a position and the scarcity of qualified personnel. Social inequality motivates people to fill critical positions. Functionalists fail to explain the wide disparity between rich and poor, or to account for stratification systems that are largely inherited. Competition for scarce resources results in significant political, economic, and social inequality. The writings of Marx are at the heart of the conflict perspective. Contemporary conflict views include conflict based on gender, race, age, and other dimensions rather than just economics. Dominant ideology refers to a set of cultural beliefs and practices that helps to maintain powerful social, economic, and political interests. Stratification is a major source of societal tension and conflict, and will inevitably lead to instability and social change. Lindsay's viewpoint is that economic systems change as the level of technology becomes more complex. As societies advance technologically, they become capable of producing a surplus of goods. The emergence of these resources and their allocation by those with wealth and power expands inequalities in status, influence, and power. This allows for a well-defined and rigid social class system. The degree of social and economic inequality seen in contemporary society far exceeds what is needed to provide for goods and services. This table gives a side-by-side comparison of functionalism, conflict perspective, and interactionism with regard to their views on the topic of stratification. In today's complex societies in the United States and other similar societies, it may seem hard to locate a person specifically in a social class, and what we feel like our social class is may not correspond with objective criteria. Class is viewed largely as a statistical category. Researchers assign individuals to social classes on the basis of criteria such as their occupation, education, income, and residence. While prestige refers to the respect and admiration an occupation holds, esteem refers to the reputation a person has earned within an occupation. A person may have esteem but lack high levels of prestige, or vice versa. Prestige rankings of occupations are commonly used for class position. See Table 27.1. There has been debate over how to judge or assess class or status for women in dual or single earner families. New methods include a focus on the individual rather than the family or household as the basis for categorizing a woman's class position. The United Nations has placed an $11 trillion price tag on unpaid labor by women, largely in childcare, housework, and agriculture. This represents a continued undercounting of many workers' contributions to a family and to the entire economy. Feminists therefore argue that virtually all measures of stratification need to be reformed. Sociologists use the term socioeconomic status, or SES, when describing class based on income, education, and occupation. Criteria such as values of homes, sources of incomes, assets, years in present occupation, neighborhoods, and dual careers have been added to income and education as objective determinants of class. Income in the United States is distributed unevenly. There's a dramatic disparity in the wealth of African Americans and Hispanics compared to that of whites. Wealth in the United States is much more unevenly divided between rich and poor than income. The wealth of the top 3% exceeds the collective wealth of the bottom 97%. About 15% of people in the United States live below the federally determined poverty line. In 2014, no fewer than 46.6 million people were living below the poverty line. A contributing factor is the large number employed at minimum wage. In terms of real value, adjusted for inflation, the minimum wage has often failed to keep pace with the cost of living. Today it is lower than it was at any time from 1956 to 1984. However, modifying the minimum wage can't cure poverty. This figure shows that although the federal minimum wage rose steadily from 1950 to 1996, the actual value of the minimum wage has fallen. Unfortunately, part of the reason for that is the raise in the minimum wage. As the minimum wage goes up, prices tend to do the same, reducing the wage's actual value. The poverty level in the United States looks very high, and it is unfortunately too high. However, the way the poverty level is determined makes this a bit of a fiction. Poverty in the United States looks very different than poverty in Mexico or in the developing world. Absolute poverty refers to a minimum level of subsistence that no family should be expected to live below. The poverty line serves as an official indicator of which people are poor, but is not the same as absolute poverty. In 2014, a family of four with a combined income of $24,008 or less fell below the federal poverty line in the United States. Relative poverty is a floating standard of deprivation by which people are judged to be disadvantaged when compared to the nation as a whole. There is debate over our federal government's measure of poverty. In 2010, the government launched a statistic called the Supplemental Poverty Measure to estimate economic hardship. It is still used today. So who are the poor? Many believe the poor can work but choose not to, a stereotype that leads to faulty notions about how to reduce poverty. Many of the poor live in urban slums, but the majority live outside these poverty-stricken areas. Since World War II, an increasing number of people who are poor have been women. In 1959, female householders accounted for 26% of the nation's poor. By 2014, that figure had risen to 54%. Households headed by single mothers are more likely to be living in poverty as compared to married couples. About half of all women in poverty are dealing with an economic crisis resulting from the departure, disability, or death of a husband. The feminization of poverty is not just a U.S. phenomenon, but a worldwide one. William Julius Wilson and colleagues describe the long-term poor as the underclass, who lack training and skills. The recent downturn in the economy may swell the ranks of the underclass. Overall composition of the poor changes continuously as some move above the poverty line and others slip below it. African Americans and Latinos are more likely than whites to be persistently poor. Both Latinos and blacks are less likely than whites to leave the welfare rolls as a result of welfare reform. However, the majority of poor people in the United States are white. Using functional analysis, Herbert Gans suggested that poverty serves a number of social, economic, and political functions. In his view, the poor actually satisfy positive functions for many non-poor groups in the United States. Some of those are listed here on this slide. Society's dirty work is performed at low cost. It creates jobs for occupations and professions that serve the poor. It upholds conventional social norms and values about hard work, guarantees higher status of the more affluent, and absorbs the cost of social change. Especially important point, life chances. Max Weber saw class as related to life chances, the opportunities for people to provide themselves with material goods, positive living conditions, and favorable life experiences. Poor people spend a greater proportion of their limited resources on meeting basic necessities of life. In times of danger, affluent and powerful have a better chance of surviving. Class position affects people's vulnerability even to natural disasters. Think about the difference that Hurricane Katrina's impact had on the poor of New Orleans compared to wealthy people. Social mobility refers to the movement of individuals or groups from one position of a society's stratification system to another. Systems may be seen as opened or closed. Open systems encourage competition and imply that a person's position is influenced by achieved status. Closed systems such as slavery or caste systems allow little or no possibility of moving up. Social placement is based on ascribed statuses in closed systems. Horizontal mobility refers to a person moving from one social position to another of the same rank. Vertical mobility is movement from one social position or another of different ranks, upward or downward. Intergenerational mobility involves changes in social position relative to one's parents, for example, a college professor whose parents were farmers. Intragenerational mobility involves change within one's own adult lifetime. Example, a teacher's aide becoming a superintendent of education. This graphic is a little difficult to understand, but basically it says that the best predictor of where you'll end up as an adult is where you started as a child. Occupational mobility is more common among males than females. About 60 to 70% of sons are employed in higher ranked occupations than their fathers. Although mobility in the United States is high, much of it is minor, with individuals only moving one or two levels away from that of their parents. Education has a greater impact than family background, although family background influences the likelihood that one will receive higher education. Education is a very important means of intergenerational mobility. The impact of education has diminished in past decades, though. BA, BS degrees serve less as a guarantee of upward mobility because more people have them, and as more and more people acquire bachelor's degrees, that effect will be watered down even further. African American men with good jobs are less likely than white men to see their children attain the same status. African American children are less likely to receive financial support from their parents. African American couples are less likely to stay married and in the same household. Downward mobility is significantly higher for African Americans than for whites. The median wealth of white non-Hispanic households is 18 times that of Hispanic households. Continuing migration accounts for part of the disparity, since most new arrivals are very poor, but even the wealthiest Latino households have only one-third as much net worth as the top 5% of white households. Women are more likely to withdraw from the labor force if their job skills exceed the jobs offered them. The large range of clerical occupations open to women offer modest salaries and little chance to advance. Women find it harder to secure financing to start self-employment ventures than men do. Women are unlikely to move into their father's positions. Women's earnings have increased faster than their mothers did at a comparable age, so their incomes are substantially higher. Executive pay has always been high in the United States, but in recent years it has grown even more dramatically. Corporate executives of private companies earn the highest incomes in the nation. CEOs recovered nicely from the recent economic decline and never suffered the way many of their workers did. Generous compensation is reasonable from a functionalist perspective, given the potential for a corporation's gain. Conflict theorists question both the high levels of compensation and the process through which executives' pay is determined, where boards of directors have great financial incentive to go along with the terms favorable to their top executives. In a somewhat interactionist approach, some sociologists observe that public comparisons of executive compensation within today's industry may influence board members and lead them to tie compensation more directly to performance.